N-O-S-T, Nost, A-G-A-I-N, again, Nost again.
Hi, everyone. So this is our recap episode of the memorabilia.mp4 web series. Not over yet. This is just our first season recap. Before we get into all the clips of the episodes we filmed this past season, I wanted to present a land acknowledgement. The NOSTAGAIN network recognizes the traditional territories upon which each participant and/or attendee works and/or lives as either invited or uninvited guests. The work of the NOSTAGAIN network is committed to honoring and enacting respect and ethics in the work we do on all traditional and ancestral lands. Before we get into the meat and potatoes, so to speak, of the recap episode, Richy would like to have a few words.
Hi, I'm Richy, your waiter today for meat and potatoes, or if you want the vegan option, there's right here. So my name is Richy. I am another co-founder, joined here by Derek and Rowena of the NOSTAGAIN network. We're very proud to be releasing and have been releasing 4 episodes of memorabilia.mp4. This is a fantastic project that came about, I guess, last winter, just before our recent symposium, Love and Loss. And just as a recap for what we've been doing, I thought it'd be a good idea to have the interviewers being interviewed, right? To see what Derek and Rowena have absorbed from all of these conversations with nostalgic scholars and artists. So just a general question out there for you both. Maybe we'll start with Rowena as well. Rowena, where did memorabilia come about from, and what's its relation with our annual symposium? Can you say a few words about that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Richy. So I can't believe we finally came to the end of our first season, which feels just amazing. It's been such a great experience. We've learned a lot and we've done a lot. So the idea kind of came from our symposium and our selection process. When we were looking through all of the different submissions, it's only a one-day event, so we can't fit in as much as we'd like. We have to have a good number of live presenters to have balance. And we found there were some works that were just so compelling and just exciting, and we wanted to feature them, and we didn't have any space. So what can we do to keep on bringing this to the worldwide community of nostalgics? And we thought, all right, why don't we feature them in something like a web series? So we just went ahead and tried to put together the series with some cool interviews, and honestly, it really exceeded all expectations. Derek has just been an integral part of this whole process. So how about, I'd love to hear from you about your side of this, because you are the one who really kept everything organized and rolling.
I mean, thank you for that, Rowena. I mean, it was such a pleasure to interact with all our guests. I mean, Smriti, Mehra, Jonathan Lessard, Bora for Art, who was composed of Debora, Alana, and Bora, Bodur, and to close it all off with Matt Horrigan. It was a absolute pleasure to be surrounded by this wealth of knowledge, not only from whatever discipline they were coming from, but also just how all those things contribute to a more generative nostalgia.
I think it's an interesting piece as well, sort of, for you both, and you've both been talking to Derek. You've just given us sort of a purview, right? There's 2 media scholars, right, and artists as well. There are 2 VR artists, right, based on folklore and new media, and then there's also a professor who works in game development. I'm wondering, can you maybe give us a little bit of a primer of which discipline you both come from, and sort of how did you think about the potentials of nostalgia before and after having gone through 4 episodes, sort of the gist of the before and after, and where you came from, both of you?
Oh gosh, way to put us on the spot there, Richy. I'll respond first. So I come from a background in anthropology and sociology. So I mean, a lot of the ideas that were expressed by these participants is not necessarily new in the sense that these are new phenomena, but rather the way that they're lived out is so unique, and being able to bring all these experiences to the table is ultimately the reason why I got into or why I have the background I do is I'm interested in people and the way they tell stories and how these stories relate to different ways of experiencing life and what those understandings bring to a ultimately more complete picture of us as human beings.
Oh man, Derek, how am I supposed to follow that up? That's amazing. I mean, I come from like a little bit of a different background, so I'm not so much on the like looking at anthropology type side as I'm more of a new media artist, writer, and kind of I look at critical media theory and media aesthetics. So I'm always looking for maybe the parts of the stories that we don't realize are being told until we unpack the media object bit by bit. And then something I'm just so excited about with NOSTAGAIN and memorabilia is the way that we can bring in both artists and scholars and people who walk between that line. Because I think creative research is just so important for understanding who we are right now, where we are right now, and how we're going to cope with a moment of huge change. So it feels like not only do we get to know people, know our society through these stories, but we also get to see the way that art and media open up our senses and our feelings and what that expresses about where we're currently at. So I think that's just been one of the most amazing things that we've gotten. We've talked, Smriti did a video that also has literary and poetic elements. We have Jonathan's really exciting AI-infused games. We have Aura for art, and they're very interesting kind of like psychogeographies and navigating these videos and everything. And then we closed off with some media theory from Matt Horrigan. So I feel like it combines so much about where we are now, where we're at now, but it's also based in the past and our memory for the past. So I think that's like something that's important that we've learned, and that's a great thing about NOSTAGAIN is like the future is not something that we just get, it's something that we make based on what we have. And there's something really beautiful in having the chance to talk to a lot of people and have great conversations about that.
So we're going on the first episode by Smriti Mehra, a professor at the University of Arts London, who gave us her poetic and visual work of Like Darima, Like Smriti, right? And she talks about her experience of sort of uncovering a chest of clothes from her father or her grandfather, actually, who she's never met before. And so, you know, combining that sort of way of telling a story through material, but also through poetics, you know, I was just wondering, what did you both learn from that talk in terms of how much nostalgia can give somebody despite being in something that is so worn out and old and forgotten or not even known, right? Like all these materials. What did you learn from that?
Oh man, so I think this was just one of my favorite episodes, and it was so beautiful. And I think, right, it's perfect for the opener for this series because the title is memorabilia.mp4. And one of the ways that we hold on to memories and we collect them is through memorabilia, items that make us remember the past, items that recall that. And so these clothes and these physical items are so closely tied to what it means to hold on to meaning, especially when all that kind of remains of a past, it's just faded away into memory. And then we're tasked with how to figure out how to hold on and how to figure out letting go.
Derek, yourself?
I mean, oh my gosh, I can only imagine what the actual etymology for the word is, and like, forgive me if I'm going to actually figure that out right now. Memorabilia ultimately speaks to the way that we use these objects as an aid or a pointer to the memory we have about these things. And what better way to start the series with an actual object by which we can get transported back to that moment and back to those feelings and reminisce and not forget them. And so ultimately, it was a fantastic episode. We're going to show you a clip right now.
London is hard and kind at the same time. I have dreams for the future, of finding and making a place as much home as Bangalore has been. Papa and Dadima had never been to London. The city of my childhood exists only in memory now. The house is gone, and with it went the life it harbored. The memory project is about remembering home. With this work, I make peace with a trunk full of Dada's clothes that Dadima had put away in the loft. I learned a little bit about him, a man I never met. Going through his clothes made me wonder what kind of person he was. I don't think I know anyone who has so many three-piece suits. In the pockets, we found curious ephemera, a bow tie, labels of tailors, a ticket that could barely be deciphered, a note in the same predicament. Making this video was a way of recording those clothes before letting them go, with a childlike approach, of playing house as an adult, of employing imagination and embodiment. It is pure coincidence that the still frame that we composed to shoot the video and where we placed the trunks were right next to a painting I had made of a house when I was just 7 years old.
Sometimes these physical items are all that remains and is tangible from a place and a time that only exists in memory. And I felt like the clothes, especially, we talk about the idea of anamoya and like a nostalgia maybe for a time that we didn't know. And so for the artist, for Smriti, this was just like a way of touching into something that she was nostalgic for, that like a childhood that she remembered, but also parts of a world that no longer exist and which she only remembers very faintly. And that for her is tied with what it means to have home. I think that is just so beautiful and special. And I know our next clip has something about kind of like the way that it was set up. And I thought that was amazing and so serendipitous and so lovely. So how about we jump into that clip?
This project is an act of love, an act of refusal to accept sadness as the story or as the end. We gave away all the clothes in the trunk. The house was sold a short while after this video was shot. The house is now completely gone. In its place is a big commercial 4-story building. The 2 coconut trees and the teak tree have been cut, as have all the plants. There is not a trace of our house left except for the number assigned to the property. The project is about the endeavor to never forget.
One of the reasons that I felt like we had to include this talk and this work as part of our series was just because it has a huge personal connection to me. So I actually lost my grandma in 2021, and that kind of process of like cleaning out the apartment, which still has so much of their stuff in it, honestly, and trying to just figure out what do I do with these objects. It's like a burden in so many ways, but they also they kind of give you a sense of like comfort and lightness, and it's so difficult to figure out, how do we hold on to this? How do we let go? And like one of the things that was in this clip was that Smriti was talking about how in the background, she never planned it, it was just there, was a picture that she did when she was 7 that people really connected to. And like going through all of these clothings and thinking about what you find out, and this just like moment of just grief, but also that warmth because the grief comes from missing that warmth. It just really stuck with me. And so from my own experience trying to empty out the house and figure out where to put things, that was just like, it struck me on such a level. And during this time, I actually went through something similar, and I found a coin collection that my grandma and I made when I was like 8 or 9 years old, and that she'd kept all of these years. And I think there's something so just poetic in the way that we have these, like, not only what do we hold on to, but what do the people who have passed hold on to? So it's not just a nostalgia that's centered on one person, but on the experience of a lineage, of a group, and of a family. And I think that's really, really important for understanding what our pasts are in this moment when everything's changing so much.
With the idea of what do I do with these things that needed to let go of, there wasn't going to be the time, and I don't think any of us wanted to be burdened with the stuff, and there was so much of it. And it was emotionally hard work to do, getting rid of things. And then, of course, this question of like, how do I get rid of things that aren't mine or aren't ours, not my mom's, not my sister's in some way, but ours because, it belonged to us and belonged to my grandmom and my dad. The project really came about because Matt, who's my partner in crime, just said, you know what, I'll set the camera up and just respond to what comes out of the trunk. I only thought that it would be a way of recording these clothes. It would be time that I've spent with them. Years after that, Matt and me moved to England, and yeah, distance gave me the time to sort of think about it, process it. At some point, I wrote the poem, and then it kind of just fell into place and became work.
I can't get over these words and this phrase about the endeavor to never forget, because memory, it just drives home how important it is to hold on to what we care about, and how memory is an active process. I think a lot of times with nostalgia, we assume just because things are so evocative and meaningful and is so deeply personal, right? Like I just like cried when watching this video for the first time, but it reminded me that like memory and like love and this refusal to accept sadness, it's not only like what love and loss is all about with our theme for the symposium, but it's also nostalgia as like an active process, a pain that is part of and longing for the past that we don't have anymore, which becomes a refusal of the present and its demands. And I think like stuff moves so fast today that this is just so important for holding on to who we are. It's not just about like getting a bunch of stuff from a past time and experience the aesthetic. It's knowing who we are, who we came from, where we came from, and what stories are really important to us.
And I think there's an interesting sort of trajectory that Smriti gave us. Sort of, she started off with words itself as poems or stories, which resonates with their background of effective storytelling. But then there's also the objects itself of all of these pairs of jeans, right, and clothes that are material. But then later on, as we've seen in the third clip, Smriti reveals to us that the home she grew up in, right, and everything within the home and outside the structure is now gone. So that the question is, what's left? And that's an interesting sort of representation of nostalgia and how it's passed on, with the act of opening up sort of your grandma's coin collection, for example, or someone's treasure chest, that every time you show an object, it's not just showing it, but there's a story with it. I just wonder, before we move on to Jonathan's clip as well, for both of you, nostalgia is always tied to the longing for a home, or, it's always about home sweet home, right? And, with what we've learned from Smriti and what we've experienced ourselves, sort of the amorphity of nostalgia isn't just a material thing. There's also sort of a vernacular thing that comes with it. How do you identify personally with the idea that nostalgia is tied to home? What does that home look like? What's composed in it? Is it belonging for just one person or many? Like, if you can reflect on that yourselves a little bit, home and nostalgia.
I don't know. I feel like as somebody who hasn't had the pleasure of travel experience and whatnot, like I carry a lot of home with me. I'm not far from home in that sense. But if I were to think of something that I bring with me, it's those always bringing these feelings with you everywhere. Like going back to that old song, it's kind of like a weird earworm that doesn't necessarily go away, and it especially is present when you're away from it. And I kind of take that same attitude with ultimately the things I've heard throughout episodes is ultimately maybe kind of concretizing my own thinking about it, but ultimately that like nostalgia can take you to very many places, whether that's physical or, like you said, an amorphous kind of place, an idea of it.
Derek, I mean, like, you haven't had those travel experiences yet, but I think that a lot of adventures are coming in your future. That's what I hope for all of us and for you. But yeah, I'm coming from kind of the opposite perspective. I've been moving around a lot over the last decade. So I came back from college and moved back home, and then I was home for a little bit, and then I moved to China, and I was in China, and I had that was a whole different weird version of nostalgia for me, because I have Chinese American heritage. That was always a really big part of my life and meaning. And then suddenly it took on just a whole nother level when I was suddenly immersed in this from every single side. But I moved around a lot. I moved to different places in China. I moved to different parts of the US. And like, for me, those pieces of home, they're just like a few tiny little things that I brought with me every single time. And that made it like feel possible to kind of get my feet under me a little bit when just moving beyond so many places. And I definitely feel like I'm hanging on to stuff a little bit too much sometimes, but at the same time, I feel like it's important. And, you know, just like the clothes, sometimes it's these mundane objects that stand out the most to us. So something that I have been carrying around this entire time is a gigantic cast iron wok. That I got in China when I got my first apartment. That always means like the first time I tried to make my own home abroad for myself, and I have taken it with me the entire time. And now it's a really good pot because it's been used so much. So I brought it to Montreal as well. So after moving back home to the US, then I moved to Montreal, and to have that sense of home, I brought a pot with me, which seemed just weird, but it was like an anchor, also very heavy. So like almost literally an anchor.
There's a weight there. So you have the pot and Derek has the earworms rather. But you know, there's something quite interesting, Derek, before we move on to the next clip right now, but how you, despite not having physically traveled, right? You being so immersed and having all of these markers of home around you mean that when you age, as we all do, and you look back, there's a very rich ground, a fertile ground of what home meant for you because you spent so long here, so that when you look back, it's already here waiting for you. And sort of Rowena, that it's an ongoing sort of workshopping of what home means and what you bring along. And it goes really well, I suppose, with our next speaker, Jonathan Lessard, right? Whose game C'est la vie, or of his opinion that, very interesting opinion, that the future is a deck of cards, meaning that it's sort of, there's some variation and you don't know what's to come, but more or less it's the same, that we all have similar experiences despite coming from so many different backgrounds, different players on the same board game. And so one of his really interesting words that he used to talk about his game is that when you start the game, he describes it as starting as a project, right? That you are a project, just like how you're homemaking a shed, etc. So why don't we have a look at that first clip, if that's okay?
Opinions. So C'est la vie, we have the two languages. I'll stick to English, and let's begin a new life. It's a game where you begin, you're not there yet, you're just a project. And the first thing is to pick up maybe a family in which you'd like to come in. Now, just from here, I'd like to point out to the fact that it's a very difficult design space because, of course, a person's life, it can be so varied, it's so rich, the perspectives and diversity of what a single life is. With what my inspiration was a deck is like all the possible things that can happen to you in the future, right? So with different kinds of events, new things might come in the deck that might come forward, but other things can be removed.
I don't know how you feel about it, Rowena, but I found this game to be delightful and innovative. It puts into perspective what it means to live our lives, especially when we have to contend with the social and economic system based on the production of value instead of meaningful experiences. Ultimately, to look at life as like being the hand you're dealt kind of hints at something that we maybe also maybe love about nostalgia, but also hate about it, which is that it lets us project and wonder about how things were or could have been based on the fact that, like, maybe if I would have grown up in a richer family, I might have been more happy. I might have had more objects and goods around me, or just a bigger support network or whatnot. But ultimately, I think it kind of hints at these things, and to boil things down to a game kind of helps us really get to the nitty gritty of what makes us nostalgic. So why don't we move on to the next clip?
We can see here what the 80s are supposed to look like. The glasses and the hairdos are pretty reminiscent. But, you know, the thing is, if I look at my own family album, well, probably if you look at this, this probably signals the 80s to you, like it does to me as well, because I associate the era with this kind of clothing. But truth is, if I look at my own family albums, no one looks like that. But it does do the 80s for us. It performs the 80s for us. Yeah, I should train the AI on some actual photos so that it looks more true to form. But I like it when it's delightfully strange and uncanny. And when I try to make it look like actual family photos, it's just disturbing. It just looks like people that could have been, and maybe someone else's actual photo. Whereas this is comedy and caricature, and speaks of an era in a stylized and caricatural form. And I think it works better. For example, here we have the junk food card, and you can see the baby bottle is an actual Coke bottle with the little, I don't know, suction cup on top of it. The choice of the theme of this game, where it's all very common, all very mundane, makes these images even stand out in their uncanniness, because we know what a baby should look like, and we know what they should be eating. And because it's so weird and uncanny and strange, we pick it up much more than if it was a fantasy setting, for example.
Oh my gosh, Derek, also this just ties in so much to the work that you've been doing on kind of the role of narrative and stories. And what I thought, like, right, this jumps to mind, this idea of like a speculative nostalgia, like what could have been, especially what if we made different choices or had different experiences? And it's like playing a life just like somebody else's cards and somebody else's shoes in a way, which I thought was so fascinating. And I think that this is just like also a really good example of like thinking about what does nostalgia actually generate, right? Like sometimes the way it's represented in media is more of a performance of the past and like a clue of what it was supposed to feel like or mean. And so when we experience stuff like Jonathan's game, right, it's like kind of mediated nostalgia that isn't exactly indexical to the past, but it communicates meaning to the present because it's based on things that we all can kind of roll back to as a cultural touchstone. And I think that's also really good to talk about for the next clip, because it's sort of about like, right, some of these touchstones and the way that they appear in a weird way with mediated nostalgia.
This is what makes it kind of fun to play with nostalgia. At least what we've seen in this clip, and what it sort of shows about our playful digital present too. We like what's odd, strange, novel, but still rings a bell, all the colors that bring us, these colors and aesthetics that bring us back to these moments, these touchstones of what we considered the 80s or what we considered to be Quebec of the 80s. And so ultimately using these mundane objects helps us get back to those kind of touchstone moments of our youth that maybe we've forgotten, but we get to live again and realize again.
You know, there's an interesting design choice that Jonathan brought up, which is embracing the uncanny, right? That he uses the AI generative images to represent and perform, as Rowena reminded us, the 80s, and a baby bottle drinking a Coke bottle. If I did, I have no teeth right now, but I have good teeth. I'm just wondering here, there's something quite interesting about the way in which he embraces having something that looks kind of like the 80s, but is not. And he said it 2 clips earlier, where if he tried to make it more realistic, it's a little weird and strange because it's people that could have been. And this is sort of an extreme or like horror-esque uncanny valley. But we also do the same when we talk about nostalgia as rose-tinted glasses, right? That we selectively amp up or dim down a memory in a way that's inaccurate, historically speaking, but in a way that fits our notion of, no, grandpa was always a good person. I always remember my grandpa as my hero, even though he may have sold cockroaches to people for $12, right? Sort of, I'm wondering here, there's a discrepancy, sort of a tension between how you layer memory, even for yourself. Just as scholars, and experiencing nostalgia yourself, what is the priority of communicating one's nostalgia to other people? How much do you have to sacrifice accuracy for community? You know, like going with the flow, the narrative of a group, is that as important as being as accurate and true to your personal experiences? Like, let's weigh about that. Let's think about that for a bit.
I think coming from the background that I do, I think it's a matter of negotiation. Like, I think it's important that you mentioned like the idea of community and just like how much of a role that plays in constructing memory. We refer to things as being a memory of home or a memory of our past, but what is lost sometimes in that is that like these are shared feelings that we have. These are shared collective memories that we have, and identifying these things in the collective and also the way that we negotiate these discussions between each other, I think reflects in my opinion, the correct attitude when thinking about nostalgia is that it's something that I can be nostalgic for. It's something that you can be nostalgic for. So why don't we figure out a way to collectively talk about it that enhances the experience of it as being more than just personally experienced.
Yeah, I absolutely love that because I don't know, there's something really amazing when we talk about, right, the potential of nostalgia and what nostalgia could actually do. But like, and it's how do we see nostalgia as not being regressive, but it's that collective negotiation and that process of negotiating past and present together, especially through mediated means, that kind of shows what it generates. Because these conversations, I think, are really important for, you know, honestly, it sounds like a lot, but like keeping the society together in a way, because we should be thinking about, especially as things are changing a lot and a lot of change is top down, we wonder like, how do we hold together, like not only the past we remember our old families, but the social dynamics and the social relationships that we have and the stories we tell about them. And then something I think that's going to be really cool as we transition into talking a bit about episode 3 is like, we also don't always negotiate these discussions with words, and we don't have to negotiate them with words. There's other ways of symbolism that help us with this process, but it's kind of like pre-cognitive effective in a way and weirdly liminal. So I think let's just jump into our next talk, which I was so sad to miss because of the incident.
The incident shall not be named, so let's move forward.
It began as a 3D object that Bora created, which was a dragon's head skull, which in itself is a mythic example of longing for something that cannot be attained. So it's the way that people are thinking about the past as repeated thought patterns, and how cumulative they become something other than the original thought. They become an environment.
So this next one is called Chimeric Reality.
To participate in a Milieu Institute for Art and Culture show called In the Middle of Chimera. One of the senior collaborators is an artist from Victoria called Lance Austin Olson. The whole premise of a lost state of sensibility comes from Lance's work, which is he grew up in Africa, and his work is about the belt, which is no longer in the state it was when he was a child.
I wanted to say that I love all the works that Debora and Bora showed us off, but what is particularly interesting about this work, or the works that were in this clip, is the vibe that it gives off. And what really strikes me is the sense of liminality, but also weirdly a closeness that comes from the combination of a heartbeat and then the music. It gives this sense of nostalgia, not in a explicit representation of the past as it is or as it should be, like Jonathan's work or Smriti's work, but more from a sense of feeling. These things live in our brain, but we don't necessarily have a way to visualize it. And so to see these psychogeographies is really striking. I've never even considered the idea of trying to qualify my feelings into actual objects, and so everything about this was so brand new to me. It was a lot in a good way. So moving on to the second clip, I think this also speaks to it, just the idea of communicating beyond words, but how these images, like the epithet says, kind of speak thousands of words on their own.
And as our thoughts come to us, they're sometimes shared, sometimes just felt. We don't really communicate in words. So I would say it starts with the feeling, and then it goes to the sound. And then the sound is not a blanket so much as the groundwork for what else is created. So then I choose one of Bora's 3D objects. Sometimes he produces one specifically. Sometimes I use what he's done and combine them. Sometimes it comes from what I've done, and together we form. Each one of the works is contingent on some form of vibrancy from a mythic past or mystical past. Interestingly, I often use idioms as titles. So it's the deeper meaning from the vernacular. So what people want to express is way beyond what the words are showing, because each idiom has it's rooted in a tradition, yet it's in very contemporary as well. It becomes incredibly current.
Like that, it will be evolving again.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Depending on the day,
The hour of the day.
the hour of the day, cloud.
And something that I really love just going back through this and getting a chance to watch the discussion, which was just so like invigorating and exciting from the perspective of somebody who does media art. I thought that this was so fantastic. It reminds me this like the use of kind of like a spatialization of these images with the sound, this kind of like mythic dragon skull, and this sort of, I think later in the final clip, we have a little bit of this kind of like planetary vision is the way it feels like deeply Jungian in a way. And I feel like that's something that's so weirdly immaterial without words, but also so meaningful. I felt like that heartbeat pulsing underneath the chimera, and it was just so, I don't know, it made me feel like I was right there and with this mystical thing that I don't understand and it didn't exist. And I don't know why I feel this way, but I do feel this way. And so something that's been really kind of amazing as we go from like the first episode to this episode, we're talking a lot about different artworks and creative stuff. We go from kind of this very like grounded material discussion of the memorabilia we touch to the sort of digital representative mediated speculation about nostalgia and speculative nostalgia. And then we come back to something that's like, I don't know, it makes me think a little bit about like Walter Benjamin's work and the idea of sort of like this flowing collective sense and these auras and this relationship that's developed between the artist and the person who's viewing the work. And I mean, it was right, he lived before we had internet, but I think there's something very just special and just, I don't know how to describe it besides like liminal, but also close. And this kind of collected way of relating with the work that I found super exciting because it feels like you're sort of walking through a dream, but it's an intangible dream that we share. So it's kind of gone full circle from materiality to the mind to the heart.
It's a beautiful way to put it, Rowena. I want to thank you for how you've lined up basically sort of the trajectory, and before we arrive at Matt's sort of the whole of where are we now and where are we going with the state of how things are. But, you know, Derek was able to have a front seat row of sort of experiencing all of these pasts as environments, right? That's the way that Debora and Bora described their works. And what's interesting is it was made for VR so that you would be immersed in it. You'd literally be walking. One thing that really struck me, even when watching back the episode, was it felt as if away from Smriti's grounded, as you've said, Rowena, and Jonathan's speculative view of nostalgia, Debora and Bora's work offered us a sort of cellular approach. It was as if I was in an organism. And something earlier you said, Derek, that really still stuck with me was these memories or nostalgia are living things that are in us all the time. And we have to find a way or something to do with them, right? Sort of like we have to translate them somewhere, either as scholarly work, as actual environments. I'm just wondering, where do you both translate your nostalgia? Sort of, is there a physical community? Is there a creative practice? Is there something that you do, an activity or something in the real world or in the digital world that is sort of a faucet, you know, to the past as an environment that lives through you and in you? What does that look like? If you can give us a sort of a little primer.
Oh my God. Yeah, no, I'll bring you on a trip through my liked YouTube playlist and my favorites and stuff. It's just like, I mean, you say faucet, and like honestly, that's like the perfect analogy for it. Like literally, all right, bring it on. All right, open it up. Come on, bring it on. But no, I mean, I come back to like video clips from movies I enjoy, music that I've listened to forever. And I don't know, just being able to like have a platform I can kind of let the not that I let the algorithm do a lot of work for me. A lot of it is just my own preference for the films that I enjoy and the type of media I consume. I think just being able to like have have platforms that let you do it, whether that's like YouTube, whether that is Spotify or any kind of thing, or whether that's like playing video games. Ultimately, it's just like having these platforms as like a repertoire for all these nostalgic moments and memories that can kind of come back to consistently or every day, like in my case.
You're listening to music right now as we're speaking.
I'm not being that
Rowena,
rude.
Yourself, Rowena?
Okay,
Sure.
Derek, so I really like want to now see all of your music collection on YouTube. So we're gonna have to take a look at that because that sounds like a way to really walk down memory lane. I think for me, like memory is a big part of the work that I do across a lot of different domains. So I've had like a lot of experiences in my life, including some difficult experiences. And one of the ways that I've helped kind of negotiated that in my life to heal and be healthy has been looking back a lot to memory and how it's distorted and comparing kind of physical aspects of that memory to written and textual aspects and to visual aspects. So very physically, right? I know you're the same. I love to write with a fountain pen, and I have my grandparents' fountain pens that I take along with me. And that's become like a really amazing way of sort of grounding whatever I'm writing or working on in like this history and this past, and that connects into the present, and a bit of a teaser for stuff that we might have coming up in the future. But I think there's something really special also socially about these kind of nostalgic collections. And it brings a lot of people together based not like only on their own shared past, but a collective shared past, and then a remembering that we do through this process of holding on and collecting. And then in my new media work, I like to think about kind of how do we speculate about this nostalgia and how can we use these new tools that are coming out like generative AI, not to just sort of constantly rehash the same old thing, but maybe to make things a little bit weirder and to change the way that we recall things. So actually, the background image that we have here is from a custom trained AI model that I made that's sort of designed to mess stuff up and make it look like a bad image that was created during that like Y2K Photoshop, have a lot of like photo CDs and editing era, but also mess it up a little bit and make it unpredictable. And I think just like for me, that kind of brings a resolution because we look back to the past, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit in our next clip. What does it mean to have like a sense of normalcy? What does it mean to hold on to that? What does it mean when we're trying to take the technologies that we have today and project them into the future? And what does that bring? And I really like messing these up and saying, okay, well, instead of just going into this like technological future that we've never really thought about and we're just going to fall into it face first and see what happens, how do we connect these practices to the past and hold that as something that's important?
Yeah, I think it ties really, really well in with the idea of cyberpunk, like this high-tech, low society setting, and ultimately just how it acts as a playground for thinking through these ideas. So why don't we jump into that clip?
The most important dynamic of cyberpunk has been hyperstition. Here, my understanding of hyperstition and of code comes from the convergence of subcultural studies and cybernetics.
Hyperstition is the idea that narratives, myths, or even folklore can later become real the more it's shared and practiced in the real world. In other words, things aren't just in fairy tales anymore, they have real-world consequences the more they are used and accepted.
Related to hyperstition was Sadie Plant and Nick Land's concept of cyber positivity, the idea that a feedback loop could be designed that would perpetually self-reinforce and generate novel consequences, like L. Ron Hubbard, who purposely operationalized fictions as superstitions. Land and Yarvin founded accelerationism as something akin to a religion, to hope that the destruction by intensification of capitalism as an environment would yield something better, that better has never meant better for everyone. Sort of catharsis theory of social change often heard among politically progressive networks after the 2016 US election, that the burgeoning of fascism into publicity would make it easier to destroy. Alas, the fascists were smart enough first to rob journalists of their prestige and also to thoroughly enframe police as enforcers rather than investigators, thus leaving us with no informatic heroes for our age, only...
So this was a really interesting talk. It brought up a lot of points for connection between what we see as as generative nostalgia in the current socio-political context, but also as a way to look forward to the kind of issues present in that kind of genre setting, and the reframing the way we can view these changes that make us hold on to that past. And this connects to Debora and Bora's work in a way. What we're looking at isn't just a present and future made by our memory, but an intensification by something real even if it wasn't real before.
And that comes in with Matt's idea, Derek, of hyperstition, right? As I've just reminded everybody, and Matt has introduced to us, that sort of idea of the more you repeat something, the more it becomes reality, in the very simple terms. There's an interesting riff here where he brought up just before the first clip ended of how fascist movements, right, or traditionally right-wing movements, imbue themselves with nostalgia, sort of for the good old days, when everybody respected one another. All of these sorts of principles of a simpler time that somehow also rests in the past. As if even though as busy as our lives are right now, there's no simplicity, there's no normalcy, right? And there's a clear distinction that they're imposing, that the past is simpler, better, cleaner, brighter, right? But what about now, right? There's never a clear definition of what the present consists of, what makes up the contemporary. And he brought up this interesting point that we would think that now that there are more fascist movements, or that this kind of regressive nostalgia, as Rowena was talking earlier, is now getting traction, it's easier to shoot this target down. Yet actually it isn't. If anything, it's clearer, and we can see it in the US, right, that they won over the guys back in the office. But the interesting point that we've just been talking about with Debora's work as well, and Bora, is what happens when the past as an environment isn't explored as a creative or reflexive way, as they both have, or for art, but in a way with real political consequences, that such folks really do believe that the past was simpler, better, cleaner, and when they come together, it's so sticky, if I can use that word in effective terms, right? And Rowena can speak about this, that it's so difficult to untangle now. I just wonder what you're thinking about, Rowena, in terms of politics, nostalgia, and all these things.
Oh man, you know that I do political aesthetics. That's my favorite thing. So something that I thought was so interesting, and why I'm kind of glad that we had this to sort of round out this season, is we've gone from kind of like this material, physical, speculative, like kind of spiritual. Now we're to like a sort of philosophical, theoretical, analytical point. And it brings us back to looking at the now. And that's why nostalgia is so important. And I think that that's also something interesting to think of, sort of from like a tactical media and insurgent media perspective, because the kind of generative nostalgia that we're showcasing here actually has a function as a counterpoint to this kind of sticky, invented nostalgia. And I think it's a kind of like, in our internet age, if we're wondering what's really different from transitions between earlier fascist political movements and the ones that we have today, is that we have a lot more ways to connect about our own shared pasts that we generate with our own content, that we generate by talking, that we generate through these projects. And I think that didn't exist as much when we see some of the earlier ones. So it's kind of like a counter memory exercise or a counter nostalgia exercise that anchors the now as it is, because the only real reason, right, why we have some really powerful right-wing movements kind of sweeping through culturally is this clinging to a false invented past. This is something that Umberto Eco, in his work on fascism, discusses as this like the mythic past narrative of greatness and like a look back into what was. And for like the first time, we actually have enough going on with media that we can hold that and have a counter to it in the present. I think it just kind of underlines why looking at nostalgia in this way is important for this exact moment, because we're at honestly what seems to be a turning point in world history. It's something that Franco Bifo Berardi in some of his works talks about as a moment of polycrisis. So we have so many just different levels of destabilization in the society and the relationships we have with each other, in what we look to as idealized or non-idealized, how we negotiate the past and look for the future. And I think these moments of meditation that just don't jump to what seems to glom together are really, really important here.
This reminds me of Derek's earlier answer when, Derek, when you were talking about how nostalgia for you in an environment practice is a negotiation question, right, of how much you're willing to give up. Another thing you just raised up too, Rowena, that's interesting is that all of these movements give us an idealized, fabricated past, but at the same time, they brand the present in a fabricated way, in the sense that the present, there's no use looking to next week. Do it day by day. It's unprecedented. You know, how long has this word been in our lexicon, right? Since COVID, unprecedented news, unprecedented times. All of these markers that make the present not just worse off, but undefinable, unlivable, right? All of these things that destabilize the now, but also makes it so that there's no single definition that's clear enough to return to the past. So that when folks who come together and they have to suck up to a sort of political promise of what was great before and how it was great again. These are sorts of ways of taking back control, precisely not only because the lure of the past is really nice, but also because there's no footing in the present. And that's an interesting sort of segue for our second and last clip here of when Matt brings up Mark Fisher's work of hauntology, right? That sort of yearning for the not yet, yearning for the what's to come, precisely because the future and the present seems not only far away, but unattainable. So let's have a look at that.
If we go back to the thinking of Mark Fisher, Fisher, following Frederick Jameson, lamented that capitalist realism had made utopias unthinkable, leaving hauntology instead as an aesthetic of the failure of the future, where former signifiers of futurity, such as electronic music synthesizers, joined other signifiers of obsolescence to demarcate the oldness of media. Imaginations of revolution had thus failed, leaving us only with nostalgia for the feeling of revolution, or at least a feeling that something modern was coming. However, I think that today we are no longer nostalgic for revolution, as rather tremendous social change is currently happening to us. Instead, normalcy is the contested category, instead of revolution or progress. Normativity was a version of hyperstition that actually had a homeostatic function that could have been understood as the retrospective production of what should have been. Normalcy was, of course, not a real thing. It was an object of aspiration and sometimes contention, but the aspiration was hyperstitious in that it served to produce norms. Today, hauntological media are haunted not just by former phantasms of revolution and not just by phantasms of normalcy, but by phantasms of aspiration to normalcy.
Yeah, so now we go like right from past to this sense of futurity. And Richie, I know this is something we've actually been working on related to NOSTAGAIN's research initiative, which we'll be talking about and releasing a little bit more information about soon. But we've been talking a lot about kind of the past and the future and how there's sort of like a retro-futuristic approach going on in media right now that really connects to this.
Yep. We're very excited, by the way, of when this video comes out, that Rowena and I have been actually working and will be presenting yet again our research at the Musical and Retrofuturism Symposium coming up. And what we've been looking at so far is this internet aesthetic called Fruitiger Arrow, which mimics sort of the Windows XP background, Windows 7, sort of the skeuomorphic buttony approaches to technology, that glossy green, blue look that you have. You can insert the image here. But the interesting we found about this sort of aesthetic, as opposed to Vaporwave, that's an ode to supposedly the 80s and 90s, is that when people revisit and recreate media environments of this aesthetic, they're not actually yearning for the 2000s that quote unquote look like this. It didn't, right? We grew up in the 2000s being exposed to all this kind of media because companies promised that the future would look like this. And so now in 2025, when we look back at people who recreate this Fruitiger Arrow media, they're actually calling for that lost future, the future that they grew up anticipating, embodied by these objects. Yet today we have bleak, minimalist, sleek, buttonless phones and surveillance capitalism. And so that's an interesting thing, sort of the same contention that Matt was posing, right? That's sort of the aspire to return to normalcy, which he defines nostalgia as, right? It's not to go back to what was normal, right? But the aspiration. And supposedly this work that we're looking at involving all kinds of media producers and consumers is that tension of how do we regain the future that feels much more normal and civil to us now, right? With buttons, everything is intuitive, in a way that negotiates everyone's stories in a balanced way and in a harmonious way, yet also using the same technologies owned by the companies that are using these things to exploit us. Interesting tension.
Yeah, there's a lot of like give and take in this tension, but I mean, it's exactly what you're talking about, this desire for like normalcy also just becoming utopian in a way through this aesthetic. Kind of connects to why some of the stuff that's happening with more generative approaches to nostalgia gives me a bit of hope in what is, as an American, quite a difficult time. You know, it's, especially I live in a very diverse place. I come from a majority immigrant community. It's been very difficult for us with a lot of the political changes. And because we have some dominant narratives in the media that are more hegemonic, right, that are coming in with what we talked about before, the sort of sticky, idealized past that doesn't really reflect what it was, but is kind of, in a way, more of an aspiration to a different balance of social power. The fact that a lot of people are looking back to that time when like actually global seamless connectivity, travel, the future interactions between people from all different kinds of parts of the world suddenly facilitated through the internet, that people are looking back to that and wanting to hold on to it when there's a hegemonic narrative of power that's telling us you never really wanted that, that was just given to you by this other element of power that we don't like. Well, I'm really just like heartened by the fact that we're holding on to it. And it's just sort of the way that we're aspiring to normalcy and the way that we can kind of look at these dystopian elements and consider them as dystopian. I think that gives us the kind of strength that we need to think more about a future that's from everybody and for everybody. And maybe we don't know exactly what that is, like kind of, but we have an idea and it's expressed through the things that we see around us that oftentimes seem decorative, are oftentimes highly commercial, but indicate a path. And so that actually really reminds me, right, like this is very digital instead of like the physical arcades. But it reminds me of like Walter Benjamin's work on the Arcades project. Oh my God, I'm such a Benjamin nerd. This is like a little embarrassing, but also dude was really cool and very into the occult. And that's where it actually connects to this hyperstition, the idea that the connections we make, the meanings that we build through different forms of communication, through popular forms of spectacle, through the things that just seem to be wallpapering the world, actually have a lot of indications, and they seem like maybe angel of history, right? They seem kind of like, oh, this maybe is just random stuff and just trash and like video games and random stuff, but it's actually sorting through these pieces that just seem like they're a part of what's happening and a part of all of this destruction, that we find those little moments of hope and try to build a narrative towards something better. And I feel like, you know, this theoretical expansion that we had here, bringing in hauntology, utopianism, it's a really great way to kind of underscore why what we're doing at NOSTAGAIN is really important.
I feel that just as a response to that as well, it reminds me of this little infographic I just read the other day, that the largest customer base of vinyl in Montreal, this is for you, Derek, is Gen Z. I mean, you're not Gen Z, but are you really? Doesn't matter. No. Okay.
Are we zillennials? I feel like I'm like...
I am, unfortunately. I'm part of that gen.
Pretty millennial, but towards the zillennial part of millennial, but I'm still pretty millennial. Derek, what about you?
I don't know if that really matters so much as the fact that like we have all these objects of nostalgia or nostalgic objects that tie us to the past. They tie us to memories of things. And I can't think of a better way to segue into the closing of this recap than to just say that I feel like the things we've touched upon really speak to these themes from the earlier episodes, but also, like you guys have both suggested, create a kind of trajectory to this theoretical expansion, as you called it, Rowena. So I'd like to thank everybody for watching this video. If you want to stay up to date with us at NOSTAGAIN and our next season of memorabilia.mp4, check out this QR code. That'll bring you to our website and our other socials. And we thank you so much for watching.